So first we're going to make some fermented pickles, which might sound complicated, but it really couldn't be much simpler. We are going to make some vinegar-based pickles toward the end of this video as well, so make sure to stick around for that version if you're not interested in the fermentation. But to make these fermented pickles, otherwise known as half sour pickles, first thing you'll need is a clean sanitized jar. Sanitization is very important because, as with any fermentation, we only want the bacteria that occurs naturally on the food to be present. Any outside contamination could cause bad bacteria to take over and spoil the food. So to do this, you could either use a sanitizing soap or just run the jar through a cycle in the dishwasher. Either way, once you have your clean jar, the first thing to do is add 480 grams of water, which is about 2 cups, along with 15 grams of salt, and shake or stir to combine. This gives us about a 3% salt solution, which will not only provide some flavor for the pickles, but it'll create the proper environment for the fermentation bacteria to thrive. So this type of fermentation is known as lacto-fermentation, and the bacteria that carry it out are lactic acid bacteria, which means that, as you might imagine, they produce lactic acid. And this lactic acid is what gives the pickles their nice tangy flavor, even though the only liquid we're using here is water. Anyways, next we'll just add 8 cloves of smashed garlic with the skins removed. In this case, I'm setting aside 16 cloves since I'm going to end up making 2 jars of pickles. So I'll just smash the 8 that I need for this jar and throw them in. This may seem like a lot of garlic, but I'm going to use whole cucumbers in this case, so we need a very flavorful brine to allow the flavors to penetrate fully. But if you're planning to make pickle chips or spears, you can get away with using less garlic. So next we'll add 4 stalks of fresh dill, which you can leave whole, but just make sure to remove the stems because there's not much flavor in there. Then finally we'll add all of our dry spices. And for the best possible quality, I like to use the spices in their whole seed form and crush them in a mortar and pestle. So to my mortar and pestle, I'm going to add 1 tablespoon of black peppercorns, 1 teaspoon of dill seeds, 2 teaspoons of fennel seeds, 2 teaspoons of coriander seeds, and 1 tablespoon of mustard seeds. Now again, this is enough spices for 2 jars worth of pickles, so if you're only making 1 jar, you can just cut everything in half. And of course, keep in mind that there are pretty much an infinite number of spices and spice combinations that you could use to make pickles, so this is just what I like to use, but feel free to adjust as you see fit. And definitely don't feel like you need to buy all of these spices if you don't already have them. You can still make great tasting pickles with only 2 or 3 different spices if that's all you have. Anyways, just go ahead and grind those up using your mortar and pestle just for a minute or 2 until you've cracked open the majority of the seeds. You don't need to grind them down to a fine powder or anything like that, we're just looking to crack them open to allow some more flavor to be released. Then go ahead and throw them into the jar and shake it up again to allow everything to become evenly dispersed. If you'd like, you could wrap the spices in a tea bag or cheesecloth rather than just throwing them straight into the jar, and the same goes for the garlic and dill, but the loose spices don't really bother me, so I just do it this way. So now it's finally time to add the cucumbers. Personally, I like to use these mini cucumbers and leave them whole, but you can really use whatever fits in your jar. So if you like to use larger cucumbers or cut them into spears or chips, feel free to do that. Just keep in mind that if you are using cut cucumbers, they'll absorb the flavors more easily, so I'd recommend using less of the garlic and other spices, and maybe use a 2.5% salt solution rather than the 3%, but again, it's all just up to your personal taste. You don't want to go lower than a 2% salt solution though, just to maintain the safety of the fermentation, because that salt helps to fend off bad bacteria. Also, you don't actually want to thoroughly wash the cucumbers because we need that naturally occurring lactic acid bacteria to be present on the surface. So of course, if you see any dirt or grime, you should wash it off, but you don't want to thoroughly scrub them down. Now the last thing you'll need here is some sort of fermentation weight to keep the pickles underneath the surface of the water. This type of fermentation is an anaerobic process, meaning that it needs to occur in an environment without any oxygen present. If the pickles come up above the surface, there's a chance that mold could grow, which we obviously don't want. So I'll link the fermentation weights that I use in the description below, and they are pretty cheap, but if you don't want to buy them, you could also just use a Ziploc bag filled with water and place it at the top of the jar in the same way that I'm doing here with the weight. In this case, I actually overfilled my jar a bit, so I just dumped some of the water out to prevent it from overflowing. So it's no big deal if you have to do this because the salt is already dissolved in the water, so we're still maintaining that 3% salt solution even if we dump some out. Anyways, after that point, just screw the lid on loosely to allow the gases produced during fermentation to escape, and let it sit at room temperature for about a week to allow the pickles to develop their tangy flavor. Then after that week, just give them a taste, and if they're to your liking, transfer them to your fridge for later consumption. If they're still not tangy enough after a week, feel free to let them ferment at room temperature for up to another week or 2 until they are. Once you transfer them to your fridge, the fermentation will slow down significantly, but it won't completely stop, so just keep in mind that they'll get slightly tangier over time. As they soak longer and longer, they'll start to lose a bit of their crunch, so personally I think 1 week is about the sweet spot, since it gives them plenty of time to develop a tangy flavor while still maintaining that nice crispness. Now, as promised, we're also going to make some vinegar-based pickles that don't require any sort of fermentation. The process is almost exactly the same as the fermented version. So again, we're going to start off with a clean jar, but instead of using only water, we're going to use vinegar and water. So add 360 grams or 1.5 cups of water to your jar, along with 120 grams or 1/2 cup of white vinegar. Then from there, we'll just add the same 15 grams of salt along with 8 cloves of garlic, 4 sprigs of fresh dill, and the second half of the spice mixture that we made earlier. Now for these pickles, we don't have to keep them completely submerged since there won't be any fermentation going on, so just go ahead and place the lid on the jar and throw it into your fridge for at least a week to allow the flavors to be absorbed. Due to the high salt content, both of these pickles should last a long time in your fridge, about 1 to 2 months for the vinegar pickles and up to about 6 months for the fermented pickles. But as I mentioned, in both cases, I think the ideal flavor and texture occurs within the first couple of weeks after making them. And if you're interested in fermentation and want to learn how to make cultured butter, which is one of my other favorites, you can click right here. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you over there.